Stanford University.
Hi everyone, this is How I Write, a series of discussions about how people write in different fields, the different ways that people work. Today is April 9th, 2009. I've gotten accustomed to saying that because these tapes go out and you think, when was this anyway? And we're in the Hume Writing Center. I'm Hilton Obenzinger, Associate Director of the Hume Writing Center for Honors in Advanced Writing. Really a pleasure to have Rob Reich here, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Ethics and Society Program, as well as Co-Director of the Philanthropy and Civil Society Center. He has written a number of things, Bridging Liberalism and Multiculturalism in Education. He's co-edited with Deborah Satz, Toward and Humanist Justice, The Political Philosophy of Susan Moeller-Oken, and is currently completing Ethics, Public Policy, and Philanthropy, the normative basis of private activity in the public interest. So as you can tell, and of course he's written quite a bit else, theory, political theory, but ethics, of discussion of practice of different sorts, and philanthropy, education in particular. Because we've had people from all the way from writing fiction to writing physics. It's a wide range of experiences in terms of writing. And it's very interesting to get that range of experiences and the similarities, but also some of the differences in terms of how people work. These discussions go on Stanford on iTunes and will soon also be going on Stanford on YouTube. And you can go to Stanford on iTunes, go to Arts and Humanities, and then go to the featured contribution of How I Write, and you'll get some of at least the most recent ones up there, of Ramon Saldivar, of English, Leonard Susskind, of physics, etc. All kinds of really interesting things. Now, the way that we do this is, after this little introduction, I ask our conversationalist to say whatever you'd like about writing and how you work. And after that, I'll start asking some questions and discussing things. And in a little while, we'll open it up so you join the conversation as well, asking questions or giving insights, whatever. So thank you for coming, Rob Reich.
Thanks for having me. Well, when I saw the title of the series, How I Write, it occurred to me to think that there are two different ways of trying to give some sort of answer to that question. First, where do you get the ideas that you end up writing about, and how do you sustain and continue to have ideas that you can write about? And then secondly, the more mundane but no less important topic of how actually do you write? Where, when, with what support, longhand on a computer, or others, just what are the mechanics of writing? So I thought I'd just try and give two answers, one in each category, about how it is that I do it, and then talk about it. So first, where do I get the ideas that I write about, and how do I keep coming up with other ideas to continue writing? So Hilton, you mentioned already that I'm a political theorist, political philosopher, and there are a variety of different kinds of political theory one could write about, or types of political theorists. And the kind of political theory that I myself am disposed to, more by sort of intellectual disposition rather than some conscious, deliberative choice about the matter, is rather than starting what you might think about it, what a philosopher does, start from some first principles that exist up in the ether and work out the proper relation amongst the principles, or a very clean logical argument, and then once the beautiful abstract edifice is complete, begin to consider what it means for the real world. I tend to at least begin from the ground level. Often what gives me the ideas I end up writing about So I happen to observe something or experience something or read about something that actually exists in the real world. And then I'll end up asking myself, what's the story that we could tell ourselves, or I could tell myself, about what would justify the arrangement that gave rise to this particular practice or phenomenon? So, for example, just to cite two things from some of the writing I've done, I've written a bit about homeschooling and what the actual state of affairs in the United States, in many states, is that you can choose to homeschool your children from kindergarten through 12th grade with absolutely no oversight or regulation from the state. So you can decide after you have a 4 or 5 or 6-year-old child, you just write a simple note in certain states to your local school superintendent or public official and announce that for reasons that you don't really have to disclose, or perhaps they're religious motivations, you're choosing to homeschool your child, and then that's the last the state or any state official ever hears about the educational arrangements you provide for your child. And I thought struck me as a curious way of operating a public policy regime for education. And since it actually exists, I thought to myself, well, what possible reasons could we give to provide a justification for homeschooling where there are no regulations that apply to the undertaking? And by asking that question, I then began to get into what are progressively higher levels of abstraction, and I asked questions about, well, what rights or interests does a child have in an education? What rights or interests does the parent have in providing education? What rights and interests does a state have in providing a certain sort of education? And then you begin to rise up this level of abstraction and think about the nature of the balance of these interests and how to work out some argument about it. But as I say, I don't get to the higher level of abstraction. Say, you could begin from saying any political theory has to address questions about children, has to address questions about parenting, and has to address interests of what the state needs in citizens. So let's think about education as a consequence of that, because they address all three of those, and then sort of plow downward. I start with a very practical thing and then push upward. Second example of this would be I observed that here in the Bay Area, there's a high incidence of private giving to public schools, private philanthropy for public schooling, where local education foundations or PTAs try to organize fundraising drives to supplement the public funds that exist in public schools. And at the time, I thought this was just a small example of the opposite of what was often reported, still is often reported in the newspapers, public money going to private school in the form of some voucher program. And vouchers, or the idea of vouchers, was really what got a lot of media attention. But you would read in the San Jose Mercury News or the Palo Alto Daily Post, whatever it's called, that local citizen gave $50,000 to the Palo Alto school system, and this was a terrific and charitable effort. So I then thought, well, I want to find out what the amounts of these donations are, thinking the common sense thought, or what seemed to me the common sense thought, that parents in Palo Alto could raise a lot more money privately than parents in East Palo Alto or Oakland could. And so if you added up the sum total of all the donations in Palo Alto, you'd likely find that there was a very large inequality in private giving between Palo Alto and East Palo Alto. And then I discovered, which led to now this big book project you just mentioned, that all of this charitable giving is tax deductible. So the Palo Alto parents who give the money to the Palo Alto public schools take a tax deduction for their giving because they give it to a 501c3 nonprofit entity, the local education foundation. So the federal government is subsidizing the giving of these charitable dollars, and in the process, increasing inequalities in school funding, at least in this particular instance. And so I asked myself the question, well, I better find out why it is we have tax deductions for charitable giving in the first place, because if I want to figure out what could provide a justification for this particular practice, I need to first figure out why we have tax deductions. And I went searching around for answers to that question and didn't find an awful lot that, at least to me, was convincing. And so I began to, again, rise up the sort of chain of abstraction to ask much more general questions about what's the place of charity in a democracy in the first place? Why do we have tax incentives for making charitable donations? And then it becomes much more a familiar project of political theory, but it all begins from a very concrete question on the ground. Okay, so that's a short story about how I write in terms of the ideas. Start with something concrete and then push upward with levels of abstraction. Now, the more mechanical part of the question, how do I write? When do I write? Where do I write? There, the answer, I guess there's sort of chapters of I've had to evolve in my my practices of how I write. And the story at least I tell myself to explain how it is I get writing done is that in my freshman year of college, I went through a program that's very much like SLE here at Stanford, Structured Liberal Education, in which you have an intense reading load and you have to produce a weekly paper. And as a consequence of taking this freshman year program, I was forced to learn how to write a 10-page paper on a weekly basis. And like most first-year college students, I learned to do this all in the night before it was due. So I became quickly adept in my college education at producing a 10-page paper, more or less in 12 hours or so, the actual writing part of it. And then that habit of learning that I could produce a paper that was of adequate quality, compact into a very short time of writing, became more or less my default mode of getting writing done for quite a long time. So whenever I had even a longer essay due, I more or less just sort of set aside up to 48 hours where, canceled all anything else that was going on in my life and kind of just let the books accumulate around me and commune with the computer for a long time. And sooner or later, I'd emerge at the end with some prose to show for myself. And that persisted through graduate school. You can't write a dissertation on that particular model, but you can write dissertation chapters on that model. Then I had kids. So the idea of saying, basically goodbye to my kids because as I disappeared into the computer room for 48 hours and, emerged after not having done my fair share of parenting, and emerging a complete zombie because I'd only had a couple hours sleep was no longer an option. And I had to adjust my writing routine, which I had fallen into. And the writing routine I then generated was that I would set aside 4 hours in the morning. And Stanford, one of the hidden secrets at Stanford, if none of you has discovered this yet, it's something well worth pursuing. Green Library has carols that you can claim as your own. And so you can basically get Green to allocate you a carol. And I would show up at 7:30 when the library opened at Green a couple days a week and go into my carol where there's no phone, nobody walked by, it was completely deserted. And I would have 3, 4, on a good day, 5 hours uninterrupted time in the morning to write. And I fell into a habit of 3 or 4 days a week doing that and then trying to schedule my classes in the afternoon and other stuff in the afternoon. So that for quite a while was my habit, and I'm now into the search for a new habit that I need to generate because for reasons that have to do with the sort of family negotiations and the new work demands of my wife, I no longer have the option of claiming mornings for myself. I have parenting responsibilities in the morning as well, and getting the kids off to school, packing lunches, all the mundane things that go along with being a dad. And I can't show up anymore at 7:30 in the morning in the Green Library, or at least not on a regular basis. So I'm currently experimenting with new writing habits, but I haven't yet fallen into a deliberate one or one that's quite felt that I'm going to be as productive as I want to be in it. But I can sort of clearly mark off in my history these at least 2 distinct phases of how I got writing done and my current search for a new one.
12 to 2 in the afternoon to 2
yeah,
or something.
right. It is true, of course, at least for me, that the mind is clearest and less distracted earlier rather than later.
okay.
So the idea of somehow, setting aside 1 to 4 o'clock, at least I don't think that would work out for me, although I haven't tried that yet.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
You just might have to make it work out for you in
That's right.
some ways.
Right.
So, yeah, the night before adrenaline rush type thing is like a wonderful luxury of youth, because the older you get, the quicker you die by writing in that way. You can't. It's very hard to survive. And so you were given kind of another way, forced to do it another way before your health started to completely undermine.
Yeah. Although I wonder, I've never asked colleagues of mine this question, but I would be curious to know, maybe people you've interviewed on this program. Once your kids leave the house, if you have kids, and you actually once again have the freedom to stay up all night if you wanted to, do people revert back to that habit?
Some people that I've talked to, because of an incredible amount of, energy, because it's coming together right at this point, will do things like that. I've actually, Diane Middlebrook actually would do things like that. But she basically had a 9 to 5 when she wasn't teaching. 9 to 5. She would drink 6 cups of coffee and take off. But there were times when she was stuck. That she said
she had kids or no kids?
Well, the kids were gone.
Kids were gone.
Right, that's right. But you can't do that with kids, right?
No,
so
can't do that
that's a
with kids.
given.
Right.
But there were times that she got stuck, and she just would not leave until she got unstuck. People don't recommend that, but it was a fight of will or something like that. So but most people don't, not like that.
I've romanticized it.
Well, I know, working with undergraduates and graduate students, I mean, this is a regular thing that people do, and people get into it in the sense of they don't know another way to work. The mind doesn't get clear until the adrenaline pumps through it, so much so that people have to make up deadlines. When I work with some honors students, I say, okay, tell Rob that you're handing it in on Friday. Tell him the deadline. He says, I don't care, right? I hand it in on Monday. No, I got to get it on Friday. Otherwise, I won't get pumped up. Well, that's really all interesting. But one of the things, though, what you're saying about the philanthropy thing, and the school, and I guess this was the kickoff for what's now becoming the book, right? This article, A Failure of Philanthropy.
Right.
American charity shortchanges the poor, and public policy is partly to blame, because you didn't get kind of to the conclusion, which was that, in effect, rich schools are being subsidized because rich people are not paying taxes, which otherwise would go to poor schools, in terms of funding. And there's a great inequality going on, and it does not seem obvious. That to me was remarkable. I mean, the common sense is you're giving away money to charity, and that's good.
Right.
You made me think of what Mark Twain called, when he was talking about slavery, the lie of silent assertion. Nobody said, what's the matter, right? It was like common reality. So to me, this was a really remarkable piece to get to that point, and probably one in which you're going to get a lot of people mad at you.
Yeah, the editors of that journal told me that one of the reasons they were eager to publish it was that it would piss off everybody across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
I don't know what kind of virtue that is, but...
Well, some people find that virtuous. It's definitely generating some kind of discussion, and I can see echoes of some of what's going on with Obama now, and some of his proposal, he tried to, at least,
Yeah.
So, but what I found also in the things that I read is that you're an incredibly lucid writer. I mean, it's very clear. And for people in philosophy and some political science, that doesn't come easy. Because there's complicated thoughts with qualifiers and all this kind of thing. And so I'm really curious, how you've developed that style in a way. It's a style of thinking, but it's a style of writing, of that kind of lucidity. Maybe you never thought of it that way.
Well, I'm pleased to hear that you think it's lucid. Certainly I wouldn't want it any other way. I guess there is a style of philosophical writing in which you can be jargon-laden, and I strive not to adopt or use jargon unless it's absolutely necessary, and when it is sometimes necessary to use particular phrases which you'd have to explain in the course of writing, but otherwise not. Students whom I've supervised will have heard from me somewhere along the way, and when I review their papers, that I get upset about two phrases in particular, but it's just because it gives a sense about the sort of academic jargon that I strive to avoid. I detest the word problematize, and counsel against ever using that in any, even spoken, it's grates on the ears. And while problematize, at least I don't think it appears in the dictionary, maybe it does now, because it's actually used so frequently. This other word, which doesn't appear in the dictionary and is a legitimate word, nevertheless, I also have problems with instantiate, because in academic life, far too many things are instantiated. So if you can use simple language, then I feel like you ought to. And I often have recourse. I assign in virtually every course I teach, not as something to be discussed, but often as something that just sits in the reader, George Orwell's Politics of the English Language. And I take that as a real guide to academic writing. Simple language, avoid cliche, shorter sentences rather than longer sentences. And you're right that philosophy can quite quickly become complex, or systems of thought are virtually by definition not simple arguments. You have many considerations in play, competing values to sort through, and then complex details. I mean, for this project on philanthropy, I find myself reading tax law journals quite avidly, and communicating to people the nuances of tax law in a way that doesn't put them to sleep is a challenge. So I hope to try and pull off some of that, and the way to do it is by following some of Orwell's suggestions, it seems to me.
Well, and also I noticed that your sentences are not huge.
Right.
They're not tiny, or they're adequate. I noticed that the verbs tend to be close to the front. All these kinds of things that allow for somebody to grasp things relatively easy, and it's not condescending.
Right.
So I've been, not a specialist, but quite able to follow what you're doing, including when you collaborated on a legal article on when adequate isn't, the retreat from equity in educational law and policy and why it matters. So I thought that was interesting too, because the tendency to dive into gobbledygook is heavy. Well, then the other thing though, because you were explaining about developing your ideas, you're developing arguments. And you kind of explained a little bit how you develop an argument by looking at something and then questioning, etc. Do you also work with imagining counter-arguments and arguing against yourself?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's built into the structure of any philosophical or ethical argument, is that I often think that the task in actually putting something on paper is to try and imagine not just a series of counter-arguments against what it is you want to argue, but rather the strongest possible counter-argument against your position, and then to systematically work through that and show why it's still in some sense deficient or isn't up to the task of explaining what you want to explain. The strongest philosophical arguments give as much ground as possible to the opposition before mounting or a defense of one's own position. Otherwise, you're just dealing with a straw man, and it's quite easy to show that your argument has something to recommend it. But whether or not it's superior to other arguments requires showing that you have recognized and given full weight to positions that run opposite, or at least in tension with your own.
And you try and work on that as trying to be as accurate as possible in terms of their argument.
Right.
I mean, you could be mistaken, but you try.
That's right. That's right.
When I work with students, I think that's the ethics of argument. You don't destroy and distort people that you're arguing with. but I also raise it as self-serving ethics because, which seems to be an oxymoron, but because you, as the writer, gain authority.
Right.
Because people will not go, oh, well, he doesn't know,
Right.
I'm not going to listen to him anymore.
Yeah, that's right. And you're taken more seriously by folks who would disagree with you anyway, which is fine. I mean, in philosophical argument, it's a very rare thing to settle the matter once and for all. So you want to show that you have given the greatest possible ground to those who are opposed to you. I feel like there's a competing sort of, not a competing, but another way of describing this, which is that, again, I often tell students this, that there's a temptation, especially if you've taken high school debate, to view argument, counter-argument as a kind of game to play.
Right.
Let's just come up with some arguments because we can, and then, you know, scribble them down on a paper and call that an essay. But
right.
at least for political philosophy, and I think this is true for virtually any sort of philosophy, you know, the subject matter at hand allows for that type of playful sort of debate. Just, you know, there's an argumentative position to fill, and by God, I'll fill it just because we can. But in the end, that's not all that interesting, it seems to me, and it also does damage to the ultimate seriousness of the subject matter, which is that we're not playing games with trying to figure out what public policy should be. So charity and philanthropy is a deeply important enterprise. Many people think it not merely is something that produces efficient things and public goods in society, but also constitutes a virtue. And simply to have an argument about what you could say in favor of or could say against philanthropy doesn't do justice to the seriousness of what we actually need to think about when we think through the matter. And the same is true with other things. The homeschooling stuff that I've written, for instance, so the very shorthand conclusion here is that I think unregulated homeschooling is a really, really bad idea. And while I think there is a place for homeschooling, the idea that it could proceed without any regulations is wrong-headed and unfair, both to the state and to the children whose interests are not then adequately represented. But for parents who homeschool, the idea that some academic from an Ivy League tower is going to criticize what they have devoted their very lives to, very often made huge sacrifices in their own family lives in order to make it possible to homeschool, arouses the most, or arouses powerful emotions. And in debates or conversations I've had with homeschool advocates, to be flippant about the arguments for and against homeschooling would be profoundly insulting, and rightly so, to people who have gone to enormous lengths to organize their entire family lives around the activity. And I feel the same way about virtually any area of public policy, that this is not a game we play by making arguments or counter-arguments, but in the end, we have to come through and actually figure out where we stand on the matter, and to do it playfully or flippantly. I mean, there can be sort of playfulness. I don't mean to be over-earnest about everything, but to pretend it's a game or to give off that it's a game is wrong and insulting to the people.
Well, that's it, insulting to the people that you're arguing with.
That's right.
You want to take them
Right.
and their arguments seriously.
Absolutely.
And because certainly it doesn't come out, let's say, in movie reviews or a lot of times in editorials or things like that, where the game is to, like, I don't like this movie, I'll insult the people who made it and the actors type of thing. Well, but the thing that you were saying is in this Law Journal article, it ends with, and why it matters.
Right.
So all the things that I've seen that you worked on are driven by this thing of, this is important.
Right.
This has something to do with our lives. It's not a kind of a form of, entertainment through mind, games. So, well, okay. One other thing I'd like to get in terms of the argument. I worked with, I don't know if it was your student. This is years ago, working on a ethics of homeschooling ethics thesis, and her basic thing was. Homeschooling by taking kids outside of environments where they could interact with other cultures, other people, other ideas, was basically unethical because it was denying the kid the knowledge of other experiences or something like that. Right? And she went through everything setting up her argument, and then came to the last chapter, and she had, which is her argument in full, you know, array, and she had a failure of nerve. You know, it's like, and in any case, I had to work with her back and forth to get her to make that leap.
Right.
You know, early on, or maybe even in these things, you've had to kind of make that leap, right? What is it? Just simply like, sure, why not? You know what I mean? How do you get to that point? Because there are a lot of people get to that point and they say, I can't do it. You follow what I'm saying?
Because if you think you follow the argument to its logical conclusion and state the conclusion in the simplest and, you know, brightest possible way, then you'll end up angering a lot of people. And
so that's maybe it. It's this thing of angering people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm aware of the fact that when I write things about homeschooling, and I've experienced it even after I was aware of it, that it would, you know, if people actually read it and if it actually got traction, that many people would be very upset. And I mean, I've encountered people who were really, really upset, and you know, occasionally still, I published that stuff a while ago now, but I occasionally get email messages expressing, you know, vague desires to see harm befall me, if there's anything that being an academic is supposed to give you some freedom from, it's you know, your job security doesn't depend on being liked by society, and if there is going to be a place within a democratic society in which unpopular arguments are offered because they might lead to downstream change, which is for the good, or at the very least a marketplace of ideas is at work where popular and unpopular arguments contest with each other, it would be a failure of the vocation to ratchet back the logical conclusion in order to appear sensitive to popular opinion.
So a student in developing this is basically nervous about her advisor reading it, and is it right, is it not right, and then ultimately other people. It's probably what it amounts to. One other thing, I'm going to open it up, and I wanted to ask you a lot about that other aspect of different places and time to write. But this is a collaboration, and I don't know how many collaborative pieces you edited with Deborah Satz, but
I've written a few.
And how have you done? You know, what was the experience of collaboration? And there are different ways that people work in terms of collaborating.
Right. Well, this particular piece, the guy I wrote with, Bill Koski from the law school here, he's much more expert in the nuts and bolts of public policy, educational policy, than I am. And I'm more expert than he is in the normative or philosophical underpinnings of education policy. And so after having many conversations with each other and hashing out what the rough structure of the argument was overall, we divided up the tasks fairly neatly between policy sections, more theoretically oriented sections, which I would write, and then a conclusion, which we both crafted together. And then there's a process of mutual editing. And of course, the technological advances recently that allow writing collaborations to happen, you know, in different locations, but in real time on the web, on the same document, are really magnificent for facilitating this, because you don't have to deal with tracking different versions, and it's really, I feel the technology has made it much easier to have productive collaborations rather than deal with all the inefficiencies of writing together.
Yeah. So in some parts you wrote, and then both of you went over. Some parts he wrote, and both of you went over.
Right.
And some parts you kind of worked together on. Right. In creating.
And we worked together first in conversation to work out the overall
structure. The overall plan and your argument.
That's right.
Generally where you're going. There is one form, at least in the computer science, you know, in terms of programming, they call shoulder surfing, where someone stands over the shoulder of someone else and says, no, go here, go, you know what I mean? So there are these different forms of collaboration. And you were able to work this out smoothly. I mean, you didn't have a conflict around it, or
Not on my
debates.
end, at least. We should ask him.
Well, you might have noticed if he was.
Right.
So I'm going to open it up for folks. We got a microphone. We don't need to broadcast, but I mean, throughout the room, we're small enough, but we want to make sure we get it on the recording. And while you're thinking about it, I want to let you know that the next How I Write is interesting. I think there's a relationship to what you're doing. Richard Thompson Ford, I'll pass this around. He's a professor of law in the law school, and he does work in terms of race and other forms of discrimination in law. And he's come out with a book which has actually been quite, I don't know if it's a bestseller, but quite popular, The Race Card, How Bluffing About Bias Makes Race Relations Worse, as well as a kind of, let me pass that around if you're interested. And then for the last of this year, a special event for any of you who are interested, with David Dunaway, who is actually a professor of University of New Mexico, but he is a specialist in oral history and broadcasting, and this is co-sponsored by many different departments, including the history department. And he, produces radio shows as well as books done on oral history, off of oral history. So this might be of interest to you also. Let's open it up. Here we go. And then what you'll do is pass it on to the next person.
So I'm wondering if you like to write, and I'm also wondering what influences you had beyond the time pressure of college in terms of teachers, either at a primary, secondary, or post-secondary level, in terms of your development as a thinker and a writer.
So first, the first question: do I like to write? I suppose the correct and honest answer is yes. But I should say, I've never met someone for whom writing was the easiest part of their day, nor someone, when you ask the person, "How's your book project coming along?" and the person says, "It's coming much faster than I thought it would come." I really thought it was going to take a lot longer. Writing is a form of bloodletting, and there's constant false starts and circling back to try it again. And so in that respect, writing is devilishly hard and frustrating. But perhaps especially for philosophical writing, the very process of writing serves as a form of clarifying your thoughts. I mean, what I often tell students, and I think for myself, is that you're not yet thinking clearly unless you can write it down in a way that's clear. So the proof of your clear thinking is the fact that you can be a clear writer, or is whether you can be a clear writer. And so when I'm thinking about a subject, I am, even when I'm quite confident that I've spelled out an outline and worked out the arguments in each little subsection, when you get actually to writing it, you realize that you've set something up and it doesn't quite work anymore, and you have to go back to the thing and work on it again. And the result of that is, of course, frustration in the moment, and lots of rewriting and revising. But at the end, hopefully, if you've done it well, you've now got some clarity about the subject. So the things that I've written about, I feel like in the absence of writing about them, I wouldn't be as clear about the conclusions I've reached or the arguments I have in the absence of having written them down. And that is an exhilarating process. So to get to the end of it, when you finally do feel like you've produced some clarity in your own thinking, that's the payoff for writing, for me.
Mm-hmm. And the second question was, kind of earlier before college, kind of developing as a writer.
Yeah. Well, I think I was exposed to that George Orwell essay sometime in high school, and that has some effect on me. But it wasn't as if I had even given any thought to becoming an academic or a scholar, really maybe at the tail end of my undergraduate career, but it's not like I've been set on this life for a long time. One of the things which I've always held out as a model just for writing, this is less for becoming a philosopher, becoming an academic, but I got exposed sometime in college to I don't know, maybe it's an academic journal, a more popular journal, things like the New York Review of Books, in which there were scholars who wrote about things for an intelligent but generalist audience. It wasn't a scholarly journal. And the simplistic way in which you could pick up the New York Review of Books or the Boston Review, other journals like this, and inform yourself about the wide array of things going on in scholarship without having yourself to be a graduate student understand, in the subject matter, to understand what they're talking about. That served as a model for me of the kind of writing I wanted to be able to produce. And then to be deliberate about thinking how to follow that through, resisting the temptation to use lots of jargon because you know that would narrow your audience, or setting out an exposition, a set of general background ideas which the specialists would know already, but which for a more general audience you need to do some work on. And in the process of setting those things out, clarifying for yourself what the most essential elements of the background structure of your argument happen to be. Anyhow.
Mm-hmm. Here we go.
This has a little bit to do with the target audience. So when writing an article for a law journal or a journal of ethics, there's always that chance that the journal or the article will get lost, I guess, in political debates or get lost in being discussed by philosophers rather than maybe translating into public policy.
Right.
Is that ever frustrating to you, or do you think that you've actually felt some tangible results from the writings that you've created, I guess?
Right. I don't see, you might count this as a rationalization, but I don't see the vocation, say, of the philosopher or of a political theorist as trying to offer a public policy blueprint for how the world would be better if the philosopher simply could translate his or her ideas into law. So the way I think about what a successful piece of philosophy can do within the real world and to create change on the ground, if that's ultimately what you want to accomplish, is to show people how rethinking the foundational level of certain kinds of arguments leads in the end to a certain set of ideas or assumptions or chains of thought about policy matters, but very rarely does anything I write issue in, well, if Congress would just pass this bill, we'd be a lot better off. And I don't imagine for myself that the audience for my work is, activists on the ground who are trying to figure out how to game or strategize and influence the next round, the next election, or the next congressional session. I'm trying to do something that's a bit more, for lack of a better phrase, higher orders, so that the background of thought shifts about it. So let me give you an illustration, rather than be abstract about this. The law review article that Hilton was just talking about discusses what has actually happened in the real world in education. This is in keeping with the general habit of thinking or way of writing that I was describing before. The rough story is, for basically 40 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, the orienting ideal around school reform in the United States has been equality. And so the ringing declaration and the unanimous decision in that court decision is that where the state undertakes to provide education to its citizens, it must do so on equal terms. And equality is just front and center. And so you get language about education, equal educational opportunity, equal school financing, equal education. And then for reasons that I think are generally not so well appreciated or even perhaps recognized, in the 1990s and still today, the ideal of equality has more or less disappeared from public policy discussion and education reform. It's been replaced by adequacy. How does a state create an adequate education for all? And so if you read sort of scholarly articles or even newspaper articles about school reform these days, it's usually around adequacy. And the language of equality, as I say, has disappeared. So what I try to contribute in this piece is not a blueprint for what the next round of school reform ought to be to make some marginal improvement, but rather to argue that there's a profound loss in moving away from the language of equality to the language of adequacy, even if in the short run, using the language of adequacy can produce some some gains of a certain sort, academic gains, more financing for schools or things like this, and that I'm trying to help anyone understand that these background ideals, which often don't get a whole lot of attention, you're not going to see them debated on the floor in Congress, equality or adequacy, nevertheless are of enormous consequence for the way that patterns of thinking emerge from the ideals. And that's the task. So I don't imagine, as I say, that this will... The best scenario would be that this begins to circulate perhaps initially amongst a scholarly audience, and then perhaps someone who's read it goes to law school and is captivated or somehow finds it compelling, and then maybe it begins to seep into different ways of thinking. And the payoff from writing a philosophical piece is a long-run payoff and highly uncertain. So that feels satisfactory to me, but if you're the sort of person who needs to think that what you write, or if you were imagining being a scholar and you need to see very short-run consequences on the ground for real people, being a philosopher, at least of the sort I'm describing, an attempt to be, is not, will keep you up at night instead of letting you sleep easy.
Well, from what you're saying, you can't quite get to the point of changing things, right, unless there's an alternate way of thinking about it.
Right.
And by presenting that alternate way, you're giving material, fodder, whatever, for other people to think, oh, well, let me see. For example, the philanthropy thing, I said, well, because what you do have kind of a suggestion, which is maybe there could be tax write-off, but they'd be different.
Right.
If you give to what Ravenswood School District, whatever it is that you were,
right.
And you get more tax deduction than if you give to the Palo Alto School District. So that's a way of trying. You do kind of try and have, but they're only suggestions. They're not programs. Suggestions for alternate ways of thinking about it.
Right. I mean, there are philosophers who have operated in this other tradition. The philosopher king, just put us in charge and we'll organize the world for you and everyone will be happier and better for it. That's not the sort of political system I'm myself pursuing.
No. Other? Right there.
Well, I feel almost bad asking this because I think it's been such a good discussion and you guys have asked really good questions. So this is, I apologize in advance, it's a little bit more nuts and bolts, but I really am curious. I'm interested in, when you're writing, where you get motivation and energy. So maybe you think of those as the same or maybe different. And then also the idea of time limits, because I feel like as a grad student here, one of the things I run into is, you can block out those certain hours, but sometimes even if I block out 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, for the first hour or two, I don't even feel like I have, I'm even motivated to do anything, or I'm just sort of sitting there thinking, and then, there's the stress of sitting there trying to work on whatever you're working on and you're not accomplishing anything. And then I've also heard, theories from brain researchers that there just really is only a certain amount of time you can sit and do one thing for a long period of time. And sometimes, that's great if you can afford to only do it a certain amount of time, but sometimes you have deadlines and you really do need to get this stuff finished. So I'm wondering, besides drinking 6 cups of coffee a day, like you mentioned that one woman did, what you do to maintain your level of energy in writing, and then also motivation to do it when you're not near the end and you don't sort of see that, shining light. And then also the amount of time you think is a good amount of time, or suggestions.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a right answer to that, but.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Here's one very practical suggestion. This is less a specific thing than something to look at. There's a new blog that's called Daily Routines, and all it does is catalog all of the various routines that different writers have. So you could very quickly begin to appreciate the diverse array of routines that people have for their writing. And so the upshot of that is that, in certain respects, every person's routine is going to end up being idiosyncratic and highly personal. You have to find one that's ultimately comfortable and works for you. Having said that, I find that in the absence of being able to cram everything into 48 hours or 72 hours, and knowing that I will emerge from the end of that extended period of time with something done. If that's no longer the routine that's going to work, then the level of the expectation I set for myself is that I will work 2, 3, 4 hours, whatever the time period's going to be, and even if I haven't written a paragraph more than what I had the previous day, if I've set myself the task of at least focusing and concentrating, I will have devoted myself wholly to the overall enterprise. And recognizing that writing includes all kinds of false starts and doubling back and revising, I don't set myself a kind of daily word production or page, expectation, but rather that I will have given myself over wholly to the time amount I've set for myself. And to the extent that I can make that a near daily habit, then things begin to flow. And I mean, I don't know whether this is an idiosyncratic thing. For most people I know, it kind of works like this. The daily habit, even in small chunks of time, allows you to get in this sort of rhythm. And I find the most painful part, the most bloodletting aspect of writing, are those first couple days or the first couple weeks of a project when you're not really sure about very much of it, and putting things on, actually down on paper, everything feels so tentative. But once you get a head of steam going, my experience is that the idea of, having an interruption in your daily routine or a rhythm, and knowing that you have to go double back again and start again from scratch and lose a couple days just to get into the forward motion of it all, you have an internal desire to keep up the daily repetition of it all and see it through, even if what you're thinking of is a many month-long process. So that the habitual nature of it turns out to be really important.
I think that's been an insight for a lot of people, but the idiosyncratic way things work is also. So, that book, or I don't know the exact title, Writing Your Dissertation 15 Minutes a Day, which seems ridiculous, and you really don't write it 15 minutes a day, but the whole idea is constantly keep at it, so that you don't disengage your mind and disengage from the project, so that, because it takes so much energy to get back into it, and that bit by bit, incrementally, you're able to make progress that way. Now, that's a way of working that a lot of people have taken on. Any others? I wanted to ask you, while you're thinking, and somebody else, I guess, might. A couple of things. One, have you gotten stuck, and have you had blocks? Have you had giant writer's block or anything like that? But have gotten blocked in some kind of way, and what have you done to get around it?
I have had writing blocks where I will have gotten into the process of writing, and I thought I had an argument to start with, and then I realized that actually, now that I've begun putting it on paper, it's not going to work out the way I envisioned, and I can't quite figure out the way to rescue what it is I had been intending to write. And so I'm blocked in that respect, but that's more of my argument that I had has disappeared, and I need to think of a new one. So it's not a classic writer's block of the sort I think you have in mind. Yeah. But I've never had a writer's block where I just can't think of anything else that I want to write about. I've got more ideas or things to write about than I have the time to write about, happily, so far.
The first one that you described, a lot of people actually describe that as writer's block, but that isn't, and you have to regard that in a positive way.
Right.
It's going down a dead end.
Right.
And you didn't know it was a dead end until you did it.
That's right.
And now I know, and I'll try something else type of thing. And a lot of people can't let go. I put that work in to go that way, and it becomes a bad feeling.
Yeah.
The other thing is, do you have a particular, I don't know, space, and I know you said the library, but at that time when you were doing it, but also any kind of ritual, or do you listen to music? Do you?
I do often have music on in the background. Nothing with vocals, just some background music, which helps me. And I am the sort of person who, when I write, I like to surround myself with the various books or journals or whatever that I've been using as background research, and they begin to sort of surround me and encase me in a, and it becomes more and more difficult to leave the office because I have a complete mess around me. And one of the best gifts that I've gotten, which I have now in my office, is a Jefferson's book stand. Do you know what this is?
Describe it.
So in Monticello, Thomas Jefferson had made for him two really ingenious writing devices. The first was what is often described as the first Xerox copier, in which he has some gizmo where a pen is attached to some sort of metal system in which when he writes a letter, it scribbles the letter on a different thing at the same time. So, so Jefferson had a copy of all his letters. But he also has this thing, a revolving book stand. It's a cube where the different sides sort of flip open, and so you can put up to five books held open and spins around. And so, I can have one book here, and I spin it, and I get another book, and a book on top, and so I end up having, instead of just the books piling up right next to me, I have my little revolving book stand. This was a gift I got just recently from my wife, which is fabulous.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. That's great. I know that Hubert Howe Bancroft, who was this historian, Bancroft Library in Berkeley, and he would have people writing for him. In fact, he called it a writing factory. This is in the 19th century. And he devised like one of those circular tables, right, where you would sit in the center. Yep. And you just spin it around, and the books would be all laid out there, and then you would, work at.
Yeah, similar sort of idea.
Seemed like a pre-digital CD-ROM type, type of thing. So, anyone else who have something to raise? Yeah. Do you have the mic?
Hi, Rob.
Hi.
My question is, for me, writing is a very luxurious, kind of self-indulgent event.
Yeah.
And I find that having to write under deadline or having to write in, small snippets of time sometimes takes the joy away from me. Do you still manage to find joy in the doing, or is it the culmination for you?
For me, it's actually more the doing than the culmination.
Okay.
A kind of anticlimax for me often at the end. I mean, even though there's enormous satisfaction in bringing any long writing project to successful completion, where successful means it's actually finished, rather who knows about the quality yet. There is for me a certain pleasure in the daily habitual or near daily habitual process of writing, where when, at least for me, when I'm in that flow of past the initial couple days or couple weeks of trying to figure out where I am, you begin to have little things to, you sort of conclude one day of writing with setting yourself up so that you can enter into the tomorrow a bit more quickly or more efficiently. Your background thoughts begin to be kind of, because it's a daily thing, the ideas that pop up in the shower or on a run are often connected with what you're writing, and they often are productive, rather than, whereas if you're doing just little microbursts on different days, then those background thoughts often don't work in the same way. So that process feels quite exciting once you're in it. It's the getting into it that's the hard part for me, the painful part.
Mm-hmm. I've got, maybe I'll ask one more question unless someone else wants to ask a question. You have to deal with a lot of student writing. And I was wondering, what is your sense of the writing that you get from students, undergraduates, graduate students, and the quality of it, and the particular questions or what you have to deal with in terms of their writing?
Problematize.
Right. I didn't want to problematize the issue.
Try and drum that out as quickly as possible. I'm not one of those folks, at least perhaps not yet, and hopefully not ever, who you'll hear out of my mouth, oh, the kids these days and their declining writing skills. I guess really what when I give papers back to students, I often try and impress upon them that having comments from the professor, comments from the grader that are critical are a sign that the professor was taking you seriously, rather than just passing you over quickly. So I have a short spiel which I'll often give when I pass some papers back, sometimes in an undergraduate class, but more often for graduate students, where I'll say to them that the biggest sign of disrespect that you can get as a graduate student, and also to some extent as an undergraduate, is to get a 20-page paper back with an A and no comments.
Right.
Basically means the professor didn't have time to take you seriously. Easier to pass you along with a nice grade, which will make you happy, and easier for the professor, of course, who might have skimmed it or perhaps maybe didn't even read it at all, just slapped an A on it.
Trusts you.
Right.
Trust you that
That's
you
right.
wrote a good paper.
So by contrast, as a student, you should feel much more, you should feel like you were taken much more seriously if you get a paper back with scribbles of comments and criticisms that are going to engage your work, and it shows that the professor took you seriously as someone who was nearing a peer, becoming a peer rather than just someone to whom the task was to assign a grade. And I mean, the upshot of that, of course, is that you should feel better about getting a B+ with a lot of criticisms than an A with none. And that might be disappointing to some students. I think it often is. Sometimes I see students, in the chairs going like this. Why did I take this class? But I think it's the honest thing to do as a professor. So for me, then, just strictly practical. Whereas I used to strive early on, before I had really sort of figured this out, to try and give lots of comments to undergraduate students as well. Then I then discovered that for many students, they don't even bother to come pick the papers up. So you'll have written a whole bunch of comments on it and taken them seriously, and they're indifferent to being taken seriously. Or maybe that's just that they've come to expect no comments on papers. I don't really know how it is that you could spend a lot of time writing a 15-page paper and then never be interested what your grade was or what the comments were. But anyway, that's what I discover sometimes. So I now give much more attention to graduate student papers who are much more interested in getting all kinds of substantive feedback, and to a lesser extent undergraduate papers. And these days I'm teaching larger courses in which the TAs are often grading most of the student work anyway. So I try to convey this kind of habit to the TAs, but I'm doing less of the undergraduate grading myself.
Great. Any more? Or of course, people can stay longer and talk in person. But this was wonderful. Thank you very much, Rob Reich.
Thanks for having me.
And please come for our next one with Professor Ford, the law school. That one is actually being held in the law school. So, great.
Great. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.